All right. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to the world of Kabbalah. This is going to be a really fun, exciting 6 weeks. You can see behind me, for the first time in our course, I printed out some poster boards. I don't know if you can see this board here to my left and this one here to my right. Those of you who have student books, you should already have that handout. Alex, who's here, has that handout, the maps. And the board here to my left behind me has 41 key terms of Kabbalah that we will all be able to understand and know and be familiar with by the end of the course. And the board to my right has a map. And if you'll notice, if you're a little familiar with studying Kabbalah or even Googling Kabbalah, some of this imagery might be familiar to you. We're going to make sense of all of it and more over the course of the next 6 weeks. So let's get started. First of all, what is Kabbalah? Right? I guess that's a good place to start before actually studying Kabbalah. What is Kabbalah? So very simply, the word Kabbalah means received. Kabbalah means to receive. Now, all of the Torah was received, right? In fact, Ethics of Our Fathers opens with the words Moshe kibel Torah miSinai. Moses received kibel. That's the root word, the Torah from Sinai. Now that includes the Ten Commandments, the written law, which is not the oral tradition, it's the written law, as well as obviously the oral tradition. So all of the oral tradition, all of the Torah was received and taught from one generation to another generation, and this is how it's gone from Moses all the way down to us to this very day. That's true of all of the Torah. In fact, there's another word for it, which is Masorah, right? The Masorah, the tradition, the handed down tradition, where people like to use that word when they talk about this is how we do things. This is the Masorah. This is how it's been handed to us. This is how we do things. And yet within that world of tradition and receiving Torah that's been transmitted in an unbroken chain all the way back to Moses, we have Kabbalah, which is an area of Torah referred to specifically as a received tradition. And the reason for this is because the Kabbalah was something that was not widespread knowledge. It wasn't something that was studied by the masses. Kabbalah, unlike Halakha, Jewish law, which is applicable to everybody. Everybody's got to know, how do you live? How are you supposed to live like a Jew? So that's something that everybody learns. But Kabbalah, the esoteric, the mystical part of Torah, that dimension was something that was kept mostly within a small circle of people. And the reason it's referred to as Kabbalah, one of the reasons, is because it's not something, as we're going to see, as we go through these next 6 weeks, it's not something that is necessarily logical, in the sense that where a lot of our oral tradition is legal analysis and textual analysis, right? So there's a lot that's, the Talmud has a phrase where a sage says something, makes a comment. This isn't totally not in the Kabbalistic realm, just in the regular exoteric aspect of Torah. In the legal area of Torah, the Talmud has this comment where one of the sages says, if what you're telling me is tradition, then I accept it. But if it's your reasoning, then I have a rebuttal. Right? No, there's this respect to, if it's tradition, this is the tradition that you received, and this is how the law is, this is what it is, then I accept it. But if it's your theory, your idea, then I can reject. We'll argue. I'll debate with you. In Kabbalah, there's no debating. Now, we do find differences of opinions, different traditions within Kabbalah, but that's few and far between. In Kabbalah, generally, it's a received tradition, and the reason for this is because it's not something that is a rational study. It's a study and analysis of the spiritual, right? And since it's not a physical study, but more metaphysical and really beyond that, it's not something that human beings are equipped really to discuss and to theorize on, right? It either is or it isn't. So that's one aspect of Kabbalah, which leads us to an important point, which is one of the reasons that Kabbalah was not taught in mass is because there's this line that Kabbalah takes God and puts him in human terms, describes God in human terms, right? Now, of course, we know that God is not human, and you can't ascribe any human attributes or qualities to God, right? And yet that's what Kabbalah seems to do. When you take it at face value, when you study Kabbalah, and on the surface, you're going to see all these things being described in physical sort of terminology. And so the student of Kabbalah needs to be able to extract the ideas from the words in which they're presented, right? Which is a tall order, right? So that we don't corrupt the idea of the divine and of God and sort of create God or think God is being created and presented in our image, right? And so that's something that requires not only great intelligence, but great humility and great piety to be able to recognize that, to be able to not take these ideas and corrupt them, right? And understand them in a literal sense. But okay, so that's a little bit about what Kabbalah is. And to summarize though, in a sense, what is that the Kabbalah explores? So we said putting God, describing God sort of in human terminology. But Kabbalah is interested in discussing the relationship between God and his creation, right? Or more, maybe more specifically, how God creates, right? How God chooses to be known to his creation, right? The relationship between God and his creation. That's what Kabbalah really discusses for the most part. Okay, so we know a little bit of what Kabbalah is. By the way, some people, and maybe some of you, we were joking before when you came in, I waved my hand and the door opened, right? So for some people, when you say Kabbalah, they think magic, right? They think, a Kabbalist is able to wave his hand and doors open, right? Something I see heads nodding, right? So the truth is, there is a branch of Kabbalah called Kabbalah Ma'asit, which is, I've translated, I guess, it as practical Kabbalah, but it's not practical in the sense like that. It's relevant practical. Ma'asit means like the practice of certain Kabbalistic ideas, like I guess constructing a golem, right, or performing some kind of miraculous, even magical feats. That's not what we're getting into. In fact, I will tell you that there's the founder of the Chabad movement, who was a great mystic in his own right, certainly one of the greatest, Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, was arrested. And this is, we're not going to get to the whole history, but he was arrested a few times. And essentially the Chassidic movement was put on trial. And he was asked a bunch of questions in his interrogation after the fall. This was back in Tsarist Russia, right? So this is 250 some odd years ago. But then after the fall of the Soviet Union, right, some of his files back from the Tsar's days became available. And so just recently, in the last about 30 years, we were able to find the interrogation. And the way it worked was they would ask him questions, and he would respond in writing in Hebrew. And so we have a lot of these questions. Fascinating is that we have an oral tradition, speaking about oral traditions, of what he was asked and what he responded and things like that. But then suddenly we got the documents, right, which is very interesting to see that. But one of the questions they asked him was about Kabbalah and magic and all that stuff. So he said that there's this idea of in Kabbalah called Hashba'at HaMelachim, where basically what it means is sort of, I guess, cornering angels and getting them to commit to do things on your behalf. Okay, he said, I know nothing about that. He says, I know nothing about it. I didn't learn any of that from my teachers. My teachers who I learned from did not dabble in that area as well. That's not what we're interested in, and that's not a field of interest of ours, and it's not something I know anything about. So if the founder of the Chabad movement could say he's not an expert on that branch of Kabbalah, I'm certainly not going to attempt to teach a course on it. So that's not what we're going to be talking about, right? What we're going to be talking about is
we all have to use our hands to open the door.
Exactly. You're all going to, sorry, now you don't have to come back. See, way to spoil the momentum here, right? If I can just string you along to think that maybe at the end of the course, oh well.
It'll still be average.
It'll still be average. Well, by the way, hopefully not, right? Because that's another interesting thing, which is to finish that statement I made before about Kabbalah takes God and puts him in sort of human terminology. There's a statement about Hasidism, and the two are going to be interlinked as we go through this course, that Hasidism takes the human and reveals how godly he can be, how divine he is, right? That's what Hasidism is interested in showing the divinity of the human. So it's almost like the reverse, right? And we're going to see how they sort of come together. Okay. Now, why is God and the way God creates and interacts with his creation relevant to us? Or put it this way, is it relevant to us, right? So we could be curious. It sounds mystical and esoteric and maybe a little spooky and like, something, otherworldly. But other than curiosity, is it really something that's relevant and necessary to study? Truth is that the Arizal, one of the greatest Kabbalists of all, Rabbi Isaac Luria, the 16th century mystic from Tzfat in Israel, he had written or said, communicated that nowadays, this is already going back more than 400 years ago, that in this age, in this era, it's a mitzvah, right? It would be a obligatory for us to spread the teachings of Kabbalah. So something which had been hidden and restricted all through the generations up to that point, he says now's the time to teach it and to share it. Why? Right? And we're not going to dive into that necessarily, but it's just interesting to note that that's something that he had said for years. But we'll answer that question briefly. Why is it relevant? Because God creates the world, and God desires in his creation of the world, God desires to be known by his creation. Right? Before God created the world, it was just him. There's nothing else. He creates the world. Now we're here as well, right? And so God wants to be known by his creation. So we can know God in many different ways. We can know what he wants by studying Torah and fulfilling the commandments, but what makes him tick, right? What is he? What is he all about? That's already it's like somebody that you really care about. You want to get to know them, right? You want to get to know them intimately. And so that's really why we're at that stage now where in history, we're at that stage where we want to get to know God, right? It's enough of just being obedient and doing, after everything we've been through, we're at that point where we want to get to know him, right? And so Kabbalah helps us get to know God, right? The added element of Hasidism takes this idea of knowing God and makes it relevant and practical in our life. And so what we're going to do over the next 6 weeks is we're going to study Kabbalistic texts, Kabbalistic ideas, and we're going to become experts in 41, you see behind me, 41 key terms of Kabbalah, right? Because if you want to be an expert in anything, you got to speak the language, you got to know the lingo. And so we'll hopefully be familiar with some key terms of Kabbalah. And in addition to just being well-versed in some of these ideas and terms and concepts, every class we're going to talk about how that's relevant to us. How can we see these ideas reflected within ourselves, and what's a practical takeaway from seeing the parallel between us and God, right? So that's what we're going to do. And now, without further ado, we're going to jump right in, okay? So if you have, we all have our student books here. And by the way, those of you watching online, I put the PDF to lesson 1 is in the chat, okay? So you should be able to, right? If you don't see it, I can resend it if you joined after I posted it, but I think it should be in the chat. There should be a link to the PDF in there, so you can download it, open it, follow it along at home. And then under that, I put a link to Amazon to purchase the student book, because the only PDF I can share is lesson 1. Next week, you're on your own. And so if you can get yourself a book, those of you, the people here in person have black and white copies. We have one nice actual book here. You see the color, it's a really beautiful book. So I encourage everybody to pick one up and have it ready before the next class. So just let me know in the chat if you don't see that link, you need me to repost it, but I think we're ready to go. So let's jump right in. And let's take a peek into 2 mystical works. One by the famous Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, the immediate predecessor of the aforementioned Ari, Rabbi Isaac Luria. And you see figure 1.2 on page 4 in your book, right? Figure 1.2. And that is a page from the Pardes Rimonim, one of his more famous, all of his works I think are famous, but you see that image on the page, right. And you see behind me on the chart, right? You can see kind of looks a little bit like that, right? And then if you look on the next page, on page 5, another diagram from Rabbi Shabtai Sheftel Halevi Horowitz, another great mystic, another funky kind of image. These are known as ilanot, as Kabbalah trees, Kabbalah diagrams. And there's a whole world of these diagrams, different kinds of diagrams, where the Kabbalists who drew them were basically trying to convey these esoteric and abstract ideas and give some kind of visual to aid in comprehending and understanding it. So, spoiler alert, you look at figure 1.3, right, from Rabbi Shabtai Sheftel Halevi, and we're going to be able to decipher a little bit of this as we move through tonight. That's not the goal of the class, but some of it will start to make sense to us as we move through tonight's class. Okay, so now, what do these diagrams mean, right? Well, what do they attempt to do? They attempt to make sense of God, to explain God. As we said before, a little mini introduction, we're trying to understand and get to know God, and he's described in different terms. Why is that helpful? Why do we describe God? Why do we attempt to make sense of God, who's unknowable, by describing human terms that we then have to extract the ideas out of those terms, right? So obviously, well, we're limited. We have no other terms, right? We have to use anthropomorphic language, right, to explain God. We have no other language to use. Fine. But still, if we're describing something using terms that don't describe it, then we're not describing anything, right? So, right, if I'm trying to describe this pillar behind me and say it's a blue car, I didn't do any good because it's not blue and it's not a car. You know nothing about it, right? So it's not helpful, right? So obviously there has to be some kind of benefit in describing God in the terms that the Kabbalists use, right? So what might that be? So let's take a look at text 1. Text 1 from Rabbi Meir Ibn Gabbai. A mortal is a mirror, page 6. A mortal is a mirror for the supernal reality. All that exists in both higher and lower realms is present in microscopic form within the human. This is the deeper significance of the Torah's statement that the human was created in the divine image. And this is why we say, from my flesh, I envision God. Right? Famous verse quoted a lot in Hasidic teaching, a verse from Job that says, from my flesh, translated exactly literally, but the way we understand that verse is from my flesh I see God, meaning if I can know myself and know how I look and how I operate, I can come to know God. I can see God. Why? Because we're created in a mirror image, right? As we know, we just read not too long ago in the Torah, 2 weeks ago, right, that God created man in his image, right? God says, let us make man in our image. So man is created in the divine image, right? What is this idea of God, of man being created in the divine image? The idea is, as we mentioned before, God wants us to know him. So he creates in a way that we can then relate to him, right? Okay. So what we're going to do is, you see the map behind me, and you'll all have it in your student books. You'll get your own map. We're going to make sense of all of this. I don't know if you guys can all see it here, right? Anyway, but I'm not going to move the camera. But you see, we're going to go through, work through this map of this Kabbalistic map here, this Kabbalistic tree. And tonight we're actually going to start from the bottom. And let's take a look at text 2, actually. That'll help us with this, right? Text 2 from Moshe Alshich. The 16th century in Tzfat was like a high point in the explosion of Kabbalah and Kabbalistic teaching, where we had aforementioned Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Cardivero, you had Rabbi Isaac Luria, many other mystics that were all kind of in that same area at the same time. One such member of that group, although didn't really regard himself so much as a mystic, but studied also under Rabbi Isaac Luria, was Rabbi Moshe Alshich, also just known as the Alshich. And he wrote a commentary on the Torah, and he says in text 2, God fashioned a ladder planted on the earth whose top reaches into the heavens. This ladder's rungs serve as channels through which the flow of divine energy can devolve degree after degree in a constant pattern of progressive coarsening until the flow can be received at the lowest extreme of existence. So God essentially creates all of existence, all of creation. He does it in a process, but what catches my attention, he's commenting on this idea of the ladder in Jacob's dream that is the Torah describes as being planted on the ground and ascending up to heaven, right? So it's interesting how he says over here, the ladder starts planted on the ground, and then all of this divine energy flows down from there, right? But if it's flowing down, he should have said maybe the ladder is firmly planted in the heavens and extends down to earth. He just says the other way, right? Which I find interesting because, and we're going to do the same thing. We're actually going to, even though the top is where we're heading, right? But we're going to start from the bottom. We're going to go from the bottom up, right? So even though we're going from the bottom up, we're going in the reverse order. We're going to be describing a devolving chain and progression. Now, I said before that Kabbalah is the study of God and is interfacing with his creation. Now, this idea that God wants us to know him, right? So therefore, God creates the world in a way that he leaves sort of a paper trail, right? So that we can follow that trail all the way back to him. And everything we already said, is in his image, meaning that everything sort of is similar. There's a similar pattern and a structure to everything that we can recognize and know from what we can know about ourselves and familiarize ourselves so we can identify and then work our way up to apply it in a sense to him. right? So in a sense, God creates everything in his image, right? And all of the celestial spheres and levels and worlds that we're going to start to explore over the next few weeks are all in this devolving sort of chain that we're going to get into in a moment, step by step, rung by rung, as the Alshich mentions, lower and lower and lower, till it comes down to our world. Our world is sort of the end of that chain. But the truth is, you can also look at it the other way, which is where we are, our experience, that's in a sense the top. In order to get from where we stand, from our vantage point, the ladder firmly planted on the ground, to get all the way up to God, God then creates the higher worlds, right? So I'm not talking in terms of time-wise, right? Time and space, where at first, what comes before the other. But the point is, what is the primary, right? It's us down here that are primary, but for us, in our experience, to be able to relate to God, God also creates the heavenly realms in that manner as well, right? So in other words, are we the effect of this progression that comes from above, or is above crafted and shaped in a way because of us, right? The two ways of looking at it. We can look at it either way, but that's something to consider, right? Okay, and that brings us to our first key term, a very important one, and this is really, in a sense, you could say, what is the main focus of Kabbalah? It's Seder Hishtalshelus.
It's what?
Seder Hishtalshelus, or Seder Hishtalshelut for those who speak Hebrew. Seder Hishtalshelut. What's Hishtalshelut? We know the word shalshelet. Shalshelet means chain, right? Hishtalshelut means a chain, but in a devolving chain, right? A chain, but one that with rungs and links that go lower and lower and lower, right? So we're all familiar with the theory of evolution, and Kabbalah also talks about evolution, or maybe more. Well, depending on based on what I just said, depends on what vantage point you're looking at it, either evolution or devolution, right? Depending on what your point of reference is. But a devolving sort of process. And again, this idea of just like the idea of evolution, which is that you can link one thing to a previous thing, you could see how it evolves and get back to its source, right? And one thing leads to the other. So the same is true when God creates the world. He creates what's called Seder Hishtalshelut, right? The system of devolution. So that's our first key term. Seder Hishtalshelut. Seder Hishtalshelut basically is a term that encompasses all of creation. So there's God beyond creation, beyond existence. We're going to talk about him as he's outside of creation as well. Eventually we'll get there. Right now our focus is on God, the creator, and in the world that he creates, or the worlds that he creates. And that process is known as Seder Hishtalshelut, the order of devolution, the evolutionary or devolutionary way through which God creates the world. Okay. So now, again, a word of caution when we're talking about above to below, rooted in the ground and going up to heaven, heaven down to earth, talking about evolution or devolution. Again, it's important to remember also that we're using terms, but we can't look at these ideas and lock them into the terms that we're using, right? So for example, we're talking about higher worlds, and we're going to be talking tonight about higher worlds and lower worlds. Well, what's a higher world and what's a lower world? What does higher and lower mean? Right? So if I said, who's higher in your company, right? You or John in accounting, who's higher in the company? Well, what do you mean, who's higher? You're on the second floor, he's on the fifth floor. So obviously he's higher, right? But that's obviously not what we're talking about. We don't mean higher in that sense, right? In the Amelia Bedelia sense, in the very literal sense. Higher means who has a more important position or vital position, whatever, who's getting paid more, who's got the corner office, whatever. That's what we're talking about, right? There's a conversation between two gentlemen in the city of Dvinsk, back in Russia. I think Dvinsk is Russia or the Ukraine. I don't know. Those guys. And in Dvinsk, there are these two great rabbis. There's the Chassidic rabbi and there's the Misnagid rabbi, the non-Chassidic rabbi. Very world-famous rabbis. One was, the Chassidic rabbi was Rabbi Yosef Rosen, known as the genius of Rogachev. And the other one was Rabbi Meir Simcha HaKohen, known as, by his very famous, where he author, he composed a lot of works, but his most famous one is the Or Sameach. In fact, he's known as the Or Sameach. So these were two rabbis. They're about the same age. Their Sameach was a little bit older than the Rogachever, and they're good friends. But these are two world-class rabbis in the same town, which is something special. So these two guys are standing once outside, and what do you do in Dvinsk? 80 years ago, you debated which rabbi was the greater rabbi, right? But in Yiddish, you'd say "Wer ist grösser," which literally translated means who's bigger. The word gresser could mean greater. Like if we were, that's why it gets lost in translation. If we were going to ask that question, who's the greater rabbi, you lose it. But in Yiddish, you say gresser could mean greater, right? But gresser also literally also means bigger. Who's bigger? So there's a kid walking past and he hears this argument. He's like, this is a ridiculous argument. Who's bigger? Everybody knows that the Rabbi Meir Simcha is like a foot taller. He's much taller than him. So the guys look at him and they say, no, we don't mean who's taller. We mean who's the greater rabbi. He said, now you're just covering up. You're just reinterpreting what I got you guys with a silly argument. And now you're just, the cover up. So obviously, when we use these terms, we have to know how we apply them, right? So when we say higher and lower doesn't mean spatially, right? We're not talking physical time and space at all. It's a hierarchy, right? And also when we say higher and lower in relation to God, as we're going to learn tonight, when we say higher and lower in anything spiritual, what we're referencing is higher, lower, meaning closer or not closer, more aware of the divine. And that is something we're going to get into tonight. But more aware, more conscious of the divine. That's what we mean by higher, lower. Higher means more divine consciousness. Lower means less divine consciousness, right? Not higher and lower. That out in outer space, right, or beyond the Jupiter or whatever. That's not what we mean. Okay, so now we're going to start, like I said tonight, the bottom of the chart, and we're going to start with the lowest part of creation. So we're talking now to use the term Seder Hishtalshalut, in this system of devolution or evolution, the process through which God creates the world, and we're going to start our first class with the lowest parts of that system. Right, and that lowest part is the spiritual worlds of Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. And based on the introduction I just gave, when we say world, we don't mean a galaxy far, far away, right? What we mean world, we mean a spiritual world, right? So before we even go any further, I would just tell you, people wonder, where are these worlds that we're going to talk about? And we're going to find out by the end of tonight that the worlds are right here. They don't occupy physical space. Right, they can be here. That hopefully will become more apparent as we move through tonight. But let's jump into text 4 from the Zohar. The Zohar is really the one of the, if not the foundational text of Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and most of Kabbalah is rooted in the Zohar. Right. So let's take a look here in text 4 on page 9. God's glory includes Bria, and God bestowed this onto the human. God's glory includes Yetzira, and God bestowed this onto the human. God's glory includes Asiya, and God bestowed this onto the human. Thus, the human is rendered in the image of the supernal glory. What does this mean? So, God, when we look at Genesis, the story of creation, you're going to find 3 terms that describe the way God creates the world. Okay. The first term you'll find that describes God as creator is Bria or bara, right? In the very first verse of the Torah, Genesis 1:1 is Bereshit, bara Elokim. The second word of the Torah is bara. Bara means created. So Bereshit in the beginning, bara, God created, bara Elokim, God created. Bara is create, right? That's the word, bara, which means to create. You look a little further, get to chapter 2 in Genesis, and you'll find the word vayitzer. Vayitzer appears a few times. Vayitzer would mean that he formed, right? And then you find the word vayas. Vayas Elokim. You find that in Genesis, you find that a lot. The word vayas, when describing God creating, vayas Elokim, God created, made this and made that. Vayas is made. So there's, to use these terms, created, formed, and made, right? These would be the terms that we see that describe the way God creates the world, right? So God creates the world with these 3 manners, right? In bara, yatzar, and asa, right? Or beria, yitzir, asiya, which is a reference to these 3 spiritual worlds: the world of beria, the world of yitzir, and the world of asiya. And God creates man the same way. So when God comes to create the world, He creates it in this way, and He invests man also with these qualities as well. This idea of beria, of yitzira, and asiya. What does that mean? So first, let's take a look, because we arrived at our second key term, and I like this idea of we have our chart. You've got it on your handouts. This idea of familiarizing ourselves with these terms. So key term number 1.2, lesson 1, term 2, on page 10, which is bia. Bia is an acronym. Bia That might be a way you'll find it described in mystical texts. Biyah is an acronym for the B is for Berea, the Yeah, the Y in Biyah is the Y for Yetzira, and the A for Asiya. Berea, Yetzira, Asiya. So Biyah is a 3-letter acronym for 3 words, which represent the 3 worlds of Berea, Yetzira, and Asiya. Right? Berea, again, created, Yetzira, shaped, and Asiya, formed. Okay, created and made. Created, shaped, or formed, and made. Okay, so these are the 3 worlds of Berea, Yetzira, and Asiya. Why does God create in this 3-step process? What is the function of these 3 worlds? So again, going back to something we mentioned, right? God wants to be known. God wants himself to be known to us. So what does God do? If God creates, and if we're the end goal, God just wants us. So why is there this whole seder hishtalshalut, right? Our first term that we use, this whole process, just create us and that's it. Why do they have to be spiritual realms and spiritual worlds? Why is it God create through a process? God could do anything, right? So why does he create us in this way? Why does he create all of existence in this way? Because as we mentioned, he wants to be known. He creates it through this process. So what would happen if there's only God, and from God you go to us, to the corporeal world, to the physical world? The infinite and the finite have no point of reference, right? Non-existence, nothingness, and actual physical, limited, finite existence are completely incompatible. How can one come to know the other? Right? So now, what God wants to do is he wants to soften that blow. He wants to ease into creation. He wants to ease into existence. He wants existence to be able to go back to the verge of non-existence. He wants something that exists to be able to feel almost non-existent. Ultimately, we're going to get to a point where there's an unbridgeable gap. From nothing to something is always going to be an unbridgeable gap. But he wants to make that unbridgeable gap as bridgeable as possible, right? So that's the dilemma we're dealing with. So before God creates, there's just God. There's nothing else. Nothing exists. So what's the first thing that happens in creation? Otherness starts to take shape. Otherness emerges, right? That's the world of Bria. So the first thing that happens in existence, we mentioned Seder Shalshal Biyah, and the next term here on page 10 is Yeshus, or Mitzius. We can call it also Mitzius, which is existence. Existence, or Yeshus, means also translated as existence, a certain feeling of existence, a certain consciousness, right? That is other consciousness. That's the first step of existence. Okay, so now, how does this consciousness then develop? So let's use an analogy from humanity, right? You have you have 2 people, right? And now a third person is going to emerge from these 2 people. A third person that's non-existent. How does that happen? Well, okay, there are a bunch of different stages, but let's, for the purpose of our conversation tonight, let's break it down to 3 stages. An embryo that turns into a fetus, that turns into a human, right? Turns into a baby, right? That's obviously one long process, right? But you see, sort of, we can even observe these 3 stages, right, of an embryo. What's an embryo? Like, and we know certainly today, not to open a can of worms, but it's a hot topic of when does life begin, right? Does it begin here? Does it begin there, right? These are, and arguments are made at different points, right? Different stages. What's the difference between them, right? There are different stages of development of something that eventually becomes autonomous and its own autonomous existence, right? And so it goes through these 3 phases. Similarly, when God creates, the end goal is to create the physical universe that feels, let's say, separate from God, that feels completely independent. So he starts to create something. Now that's something much like an embryo, which is really just cells from the parents. There's nothing other than that it's the parent cells, right? To then becoming a fetus that starts to take shape as something that will now become independent, to then becoming something fully developed, fully fashioned, and fully formed that is now viable, right, outside of the womb, right? So that's essentially what's going on. We have the world of Bria. The word Bria, which means created, is that first step. In fact, Nachmanides was a great mystic in his own right, and wrote a commentary on the Torah right in the beginning. Genesis, he describes this idea, Bereshit bara, that God creates. The word bara, he says that the word bara, that term for creation, is the only way we can, that's the only word we have to describe creation, something from nothing. Ex nihilo, something from nothing. right? That's what that term means. So Bereshit bara, the first thing was something out of nothing, right? So that's Bria, something from nothing, but it's a something that really feels the nothingness from which it came, right? That's so. So if you look at the chart on page 11, Beria is created. It's the first appearance of something new, something other than, right? Something that exists suddenly, but its feeling of existence is minimal. From there, it then goes on to the world of Yetzirah, which is formed. So now this, let's call it there's the matter, the form, and then its final, and then the final product, right? So there's this matter that's sort of abstract, right? Almost like it's an energy, let's say, that's completely undefinable and abstract, but it's a something. Then it takes on some kind of a form. It starts to develop until it finally becomes the final finished product. So that's Beria, Yitzir, and Asiya, these three stages in the development of Yashut, of Mitziut, of existence, 3 steps of existence. Okay, what's the difference between them? In other words, this we just described, right? More form, more existence, more existence. What's that mean? So like I mentioned before, it's a matter of how much of its creator it feels and how much of itself it feels. So in Beria, you have minimal self-awareness. There's already a sense of self. There's already something here, something other than God, but it mostly is aware of God. It doesn't really feel its own self, right? Yetzirah, more self-awareness, not fully, but more self-awareness. And in Asiya, you finally have the ultimate full awareness of self, to the point that we end up in our world of Asiya, which is, we're in the lowest rung of this world of Asiya, where we only feel self. We don't feel the divine, right? So you see that evolution from only feeling the divine and not feeling the self that is, to going all the way down to the point where you don't even feel the divine, you just feel yourself. Right, kind of even like a child that before it's born only feels its parents, doesn't feel anything separate, comes out, and now it becomes a teenager and is like, who are you? Why you live in my house? Right, the ultimate independence. Right. So, okay, an analogy for this would be children. Right, you have kids that take 3 teenagers, right, and you ask them to tell me about you. Tell me about yourself. And you get 3 very different answers. You have it. It's like this couple went on a date to get married, and things are going great, and they like each other, and everything's progressing. And eventually, the guy pops the question and asks the girl to marry him, and she says, "I need to ask my mother." Right. So that is somebody who's hasn't fully developed their sense of self and their independence. That when they're being asked to be married, I got to ask my mother, right? So we all could relate to these kinds. We all know these people that there are people that are fully independent. I have my own opinions, I have my own things, my parents, whatever. I don't give a that. I can tell you who I am, what I like, what I want, what I'm interested in, where I'm going, what I'm doing. And then I don't know. Ask my mother, ask my father. I don't know, right? And then there are people that are in between, in the middle. What's the difference between them? They're all the same. In a sense, they might all have the same IQ, they might have the same education, the same level of being raised, they're all in the same class or whatever. The difference is how much of an influence are your parents on your life, right? How involved are they in your life? And did they give you a space to explore your own individuality or not, right? So you can have parents that are very overbearing over their children, and they didn't give their children a chance to explore, or kids themselves that want to just retreat into, just want to remain in their mother's womb. Whatever, this is certain personalities, right? But the point is, you see people that are have more self, more sense of self, and people with less of a sense of self, right? This would be an analogy to Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya, right? And we mentioned before about extracting things. There's this another general principle whenever we study Jewish mysticism, is that we try to make sense of it, understand it. So we use metaphor, right? And you use parables and examples and stories and anecdotes and analogies. We have to always remember, since we're talking about abstract topics, the analogy never fits exactly. We use it to relate to a certain concept, but it'll never fit exactly. And this is a good example of it, right? Because if we're talking about the analogy, I think we can all agree that you'd like to see children that are independent, that have their own opinion, that have a good, healthy sense of self, right? Self-confidence and just they're self-sufficient, right? Get out of my basement, get on with your life, right? So that's what we hope for with our children. But when we apply that back to Bria, Yetzirah, Asiya, in a sense, it's the opposite. Bria senses God, and therefore doesn't feel any sense of self. There, you could say And again, you could, by the way, maybe not, depends the vantage point we're exploring it from, but on certainly on an obvious level and sense, the more divine consciousness seemingly the better, right? So the less sense of self, that's a good thing. Less sense of self, less of that your own sort of existence, right? The more space you occupy, the less space there is for God, right? And the more space God occupies, the less space you occupy, right?
Right,
Yeah.
Question
Sure.
to that point, as in that you kind of partially saw the question coming.
Okay.
I was going to ask, but you kind of in follow up to it. Does God want you out of the basement?
That's a good question. So that's a good question. You see, we got in trouble. I don't want to get distracted by that. The answer is yes or no, though. Of course, typical Jewish answer, right? The answer is yes or no.
We need 2 more rabbis to give this.
The answer is yes or no. God does. The question here in person was, does God want us out of the basement? A life is about this tension between divine awareness and living in this world that we mentioned before, right? The ultimate intention was for us in this world, for us separate creations that feel separate from God, that feel disconnected, right? To find that connection to God. When you find that connection, all you want to do is expire into God. But you remember, there's a mission for us to perform down here. We have a task here, and that's the ebb and flow of sort of the divine connection. One of the reasons that the soul is referred to, using analogy, right, in scripture actually, as a candle, right? The flame, the soul is compared to a flame. It's because you see a flame flickers, right? On the one hand, the flame. So the mystics explain, why is the flame defies gravity, goes up. Why is a flame? Why is it not coming down? Why is a flame flicker up? Because everything goes to its source. So everything came from the ground. God creates everything, fashions everything from the ground. Everything is drawn back to its source, to the ground. Fire comes from behind the sun. The source of fire is beyond the sun. So the fire is also being drawn to its source, which is up beyond the sun. That's where it's going. Now, what would happen if the flame were to get its wish to reunite with its source and jump off of the wick? What would happen to that flame if it jumped off the wick? The wick would cease to exist. So it gets pulled back down. Gets pulled back by the wick. So it's flickering. It's going up and down, up and down. And that's why the soul is referred to in the same way as a candle, because the soul also yearns to expire into God and total lose itself completely in divine awareness. And on the other hand, God wants us to bring God into this world and make him present in this world, not expire out of this world.
Is that why we rock when we daven?
That's one of the reasons we rock when we daven. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
No
Yeah.
control over it.
Right. Yeah. That's one of the reasons. Yes. So, okay. So this brings us to another term, this idea of bittul, right? So where are we at? We're at our 4th term of the day, right? Bittul. We have Seder Shtalshalit, we have Biyah, we have Yeshus or Metzius, and we have bittul. Bittul, which means, bittul is on page 13. Surrender, suspension, nullification, right? The idea of bittul means this idea where existence feels completely surrendered and subdued to God, feels the divine and not itself. The awareness of the divine, not itself. You could say you experience bittul. I mean, it depends on what you're interested in, obviously. But let's say you're very into music, right? And you can listen to a song and not breathe for like 10 seconds and not even notice, right? Because you're so absorbed in the music. So what happened? You got so absorbed in the music. Music was so overwhelming. It was so beautiful that you stopped breathing. What do you mean? You need to breathe to exist. Yeah, but you lost any sense of self, right? Or you say, like, when you're in your flow state, right? Where that's a new trendy topic, right? To be in your flow state when you're just where you don't even notice. You worked now for 6 hours straight, and you thought it was like 2 minutes. It felt like 2 minutes. How did that happen? Because you lost any sense of self. You were completely consumed by something beyond you. So bittul is the not just losing that feeling of self and feeling something beyond, right? Okay. So now, so we have this idea of being completely self, that you can have your existence and yet completely surrendered. That's the world of Bria. And as you go further away, the less God, aware you are, and the more self-aware you are, the more resistant, in a sense, to God. The more the more you feel your own self. That's this devolution further away, right, or lower, right, meaning in relation to divine awareness from God. Okay. Now we have a sense of these worlds of Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, right? We have a good sense of what they are and their role and their function, the function they play within creation, right? Which is that the God wants to create something from nothing, and the way he does it is by creating a something that doesn't feel itself, feels only God, and then gradually the next world, in the next world, it continues to devolve into more self-awareness, more existence, and less God consciousness, and so, until it finally takes the final form in our world, Asiya Gufnit, the lowest world, the lowest rung within the lowest world of Asiya, of the finished product of creation, which is only self-awareness and no divine awareness, right? We have the capacity for divine consciousness and awareness, but it's not something that we just have. It's something we innately have the capacity for, but it's not something that our default settings we experience ourselves not the divine, right? Okay, now let's jump to further understand these concepts. Let's apply them to our own selves. How do how does this concept apply to us? We use the analogy of kids that are independent or not independent. We use the analogy of the development of a fetus, but how does it apply to us sitting here together? What is the practical takeaway when we study about Bria, Yitzir, Asiya? How does that apply to us? And as we started this class with the text from the Zohar, that God creates the world with this Bria, Yitzir, Asiya, and implanted it in us, where do we find this within ourselves? Okay, so let me ask you to do me a favor, and I want you to think that 2 + 2 = 5. If it's been a while since you were in the first grade, you might actually believe that, but it hasn't changed. I want you to think 2 + 2 = 5. And now, if you want to say it, you can say 2 + 2 = 5, right? There you go, 2 + 2 = 5, very good. And if you want to write down 2 + 2 = 5, you can write it down as well. 2 + 2 = 5, right? And the same is true, not just about 2 + 2 = 5, but let's say thinking, I want you to think that you love mushrooms. I know that's impossible virtually, but bear with me, right? Think you you actually do. I always have to.
I love
You love eating moldy tofu, right? I love eating moldy tofu. There we go. Fine. Think that. You said it. You said, I love eating moldy tofu. Didn't you just say that?
I just said
You said you love eating moldy. And if you write it down as well, what's the point of this exercise? The point of the exercise is 2 + 2 does not equal 5, right? And nobody likes to eat moldy tofu, right? But I asked you to think of an idea, 2 + 2 = 5, and also to experience or think of a feeling, an emotion, which is the way you feel about moldy tofu, in a way that doesn't really compute with you, right? 2 + 2 does not equal 5 in your mind, in your brain. Now, you could think it, right? We just did, but you can't, your brain will never accept that 2 + 2 = 5 because it doesn't. And your intelligence doesn't allow you to comprehend something that's incomprehensible. And the same is true with your feelings. Your feelings are part of who you are. Either you like moldy tofu or you don't. Now, you could think you like it, but it's not going to make you like it, right? What's the point? The point is there's who we are, and then there's things that are outside of ourselves. We are intelligent beings and emotional beings. That's who we are. Our capacity to understand truth and ideas, even conflicting ideas, whatever. But the point is, ideas, sound ideas, reasonable ideas. That's part of who we are, right? The greater your capacity, maybe the more abstract and deeper ideas you can comprehend. But the point is, you can comprehend the comprehensible. And feelings, we all have feelings, and we feel in any way about any number of things, right? We're always feeling about all kinds of things. That's who we are. What we think and what we say and what we do is not who we are, which is why you can't understand 2 + 2 = 5, but you could think it. You can even say it, and you can write it, do it, right? You can say you love moldy tofu, but that's not going to that's not a reflection of what's going on inside, right? If you don't love moldy tofu, you can't feel loving towards moldy tofu. You can't feel it, right? So you could say it, you can communicate it, you could think it, right? You can write it, but you can't actually feel it. That's not who you are. So these three things, your thought, your speech, and your action, are what's called the levushei hanefesh, the garments of the soul, which is our next key term for tonight, our 5th key term for the night. Levushei hanefesh, the garments of the soul. The garments of the soul, meaning, or they're the expression of yourself. They're not you, they're your expression. In other words, when you, for the purpose of this conversation, your body is you, right? Really, but we're going to go deeper. We're going to find that it's not, we can go deeper and deeper. But for the purpose of this conversation, your body, that's you, right? to change a body part is major surgery, right? It's a major operation, right? Your garments, your clothing aren't you. Now we all know clothes make the man, right? So your clothing, you buy clothing that fit you, right? So it has to be something that's measured to fit, obviously, it fits you, and the style of clothing that's measured to fit your personality and what it is, however you want to present yourself to the world, right? So your clothing are an expression of you, but they're not you, which is why most of your clothing are in your closet, but all of your body is here tonight, right? You can take clothes off, you can put them on, you can take them off. In fact, you can wear somebody else's clothes, right? You can't wear somebody else's body. You can't transfer one body part for you can't replace them so easily, right? So your clothing, while they reflect you and are connected to you and you influence them, they influence you, they are not you. They're something outside of yourself, right? Those are the garments. And these garments of your garments, the way you express yourself outward, are thought, speech, and action, right? So think about, just like clothing also, when you decided to go out and show yourself to the world today, by walking out of your front door, you put on clothing, right? You got dressed to go outside. Isn't that ironic that you would cover yourself to reveal yourself? I wouldn't be seen in public naked, right? Well, think about those words. I wouldn't be seen naked. Well, how could you be seen if you're clothed? Nobody can see. You're blocking most of you, right? Isn't that how? And yet that's precisely how it works. In order to be seen, you need to cover, right? You cover yourself up in order to be seen, right? So our garments, in a sense, conceal us. They cover us, right? To one degree or another. While at the same time reveal us. So our thought, speech, and action do exactly the same thing. We have intelligence and we have emotion. But when you start thinking your ideas, or you start thinking about your emotions, what's going to happen is you're going to limit them in some way. They're going to be restricted. They're restricted to the thoughts you have about them, right? When you're going to speak about your feelings, you're going to speak about feelings, and it's going to limit. Sometimes you don't have the words, right? You say, words fail me. I can't describe what I'm feeling, right? Because your emotion is so much bigger. And certainly when you act, it's certainly even more removed from yourself. And so on the one hand, I don't know what you're feeling unless you've communicated it to me, right? And in fact, even yourself, you might not know what you're feeling unless you're actually thinking it to yourself, right? Also, so these are ways that we bring the subconscious to our own conscious selves, plus communicate them outward, right? I would have no idea what's going on in your internal world unless you communicate it to me through one of your garments, right? Well, not your thinking, I can't read your thoughts, but through your speech and your action. And your speech can't really say or think or do anything meaningful to convey what's going on inside without thinking about it first, right? So that's the way it gets revealed, and at the same time it conceals, because it's limited in what you can actually reveal. Okay, so we see that these are the garments of the soul: our thought, our speech, and our action. They reveal while they also conceal, and they are not us; they are outside of ourselves. They're external to us, right? And these three garments parallel these three worlds of Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya. Let's take a look at text 6a from Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Leadi, the founder of Chabad, the author of the Tanya. We mentioned him right in the beginning here. So he says 6a, page 15. Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya are comparable to physical garments. We can always remove our garments and dress in alternative garments because garments are not part of our essential selves. In the soul's experience, this correlates to thought, speech, and action, which are not relevant to the core of the soul, but serve only as its garments. Right? Now, what's this? How do they correspond? So let's keep going. Text 6b. Okay? Text 6b. Bria corresponds to thinking, Yitzira to speaking, and Asiya to physical action. Right? How does that work? What's the correlation between Bria to thinking, Yitzira to speaking, and Asiya to physical action? What's the correlation? Think about what we said before about expressing yourself.
They all come from within us versus outside of us. In other words,
Well, we're saying the garments are outside, and we're saying they correlate to Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya. Now, remember what we said about Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya, that they are the first emergence of existence. Before creation, there's only God. So the world that starts to exist, any existence, the sense of existence, the sense of yeshus that we spoke about before, or mitziyut, that I exist, means that I exist outside of God. If I exist within God, now, of course, as we're going to learn eventually, nothing exists outside of God. We're talking about from the vantage point of the existence, right? Which is that if I feel that I exist, then I have to exist separate from God, right? In other words, Bria is where we start outside of God. Which, remember, I told you that will make sense of that chart, that tree, figure 1.2, right? What page is it? You have it. You have it. If you look at what you have in the student book, but I don't have it in my copy. But if you go back to page 5, right, you'll see. Go back to that circle, the circle diagram. You'll see that on the right and left wings, you see God's name, but the inner circles don't have God's name in that wing. It stops, right? And those circles, if you follow them around, the ones that don't have God's name, the 4-letter name of God on either side, those correspond to Bria, Yitzir, and Asiyah. There are more circles because it talks about more levels of that. That's not the topic for tonight. We're not going to get into that. But the point is, you see, why? Because they exist outside of God. Bria, the first emergence of existence, means something independent, something that feels other than God, outside of God. So they exist already outside, just like we said about our garments that are outside of us. Yeah, this is making sense so far? Good. Okay.
No, I'll tell you
No,
where I'm
yeah.
stuck. I'm
Where are you
stuck
stuck?
on thought.
Okay.
Because I can agree with you. You can think of nonsense. You can think that 2 + 2 is 5. And you can switch your train of thought. But what is the part of your thought that is you? If that's just a garment.
There isn't a part. Now, thought is what's closest related. So let's try this. Think about somebody that you really love. Think about a person you really love, right? And now maybe somebody wants to share. You can start speaking about that person, right? And you can also pantomime, right? Just start flailing around. Let's play a game of charades and show me how much you love that person, right? If you think this exercise through, you'll realize that in your behaviors, in your actions, to motion to me how much you love somebody, you'll feel less love. When you speak it, you'll feel a little bit more love. They'll start to stir those emotions more. And when you think it, you'll feel even more, right? As we go up from action all the way back to our thinking, in fact, thinking is referred to also by the mystics as the vush hamiyuchad, like it's like a garment almost that we don't ever take off, in a sense. And one of the differences between thought and speech and action is that thought never stops. You're always thinking, consciously or subconsciously. You're always thinking. You can never shut off your thought process. You're always thinking. But what makes it a garment and why it's not yours? Because you can think nonsense, like you said, and you can change what you think about at any moment. You can always change what you think about. So that's not you. I can't change. I could change how I feel, and eventually we're going to maybe discuss also that process of how, but that's a very difficult process. Thinking sometimes takes a little practice, but we can change what we're thinking about at any given moment. Like right now, you're thinking about your question. If I told you not to think about a pink elephant, now what are you thinking about? Right? Just like that. Right? So that's why it's external. It's not us. But it's in a sense the bridge from the subconscious to the conscious. Right? Okay. So that's why it is very closely related to us, but it is separate. And in a sense, by the way, that we go back to the parallel, to the worlds. Bria is parallel to thought. Bria, there's existence, but basically feels God. It doesn't feel really that otherness. A little bit of the otherness. There's otherness there, but it doesn't really feel it. Right? So Bria is the world of angels, of souls that don't feel separate from God. Right? We're talking about souls, we're talking about angels. These are entities of some kind, right? And yet they don't feel themselves. They're only aware of God, right? That's parallel to thought. Speech is a little further away, right? Speech is a little less me inside, which is why when I speak things, I water down my experience in that process, right? And action is completely separated, completely almost, action is completely disconnected.
I guess action, but
right.
Thought, it seems that there are, levels of thought, and my feelings of love towards someone that I love is one thing. And just because you say pink elephant and I think pink elephant, it doesn't change the way I feel. It
doesn't change the way you feel. Exactly. But that's precisely the point. But your thinking is not you. The way you'll feel regardless, because that's you. Your thinking, you'll think about this, you'll think about that. Your thought process is kind of fickle. You think about whatever. That's not you. Right? Okay.
All right.
So Rabbi,
yes.
To follow up on my next question, are you drawing, or is there in Kabbalah a distinction drawn between thought and feeling?
Yes, sure. Thought and feeling. Thought is you can say your thought is your bridge from your internal self to your external self, right? Or from your subconscious, both intelligence and emotion, your intellect and emotion into your conscious expression, right? Now, we mentioned before about Bria in the world where you have angels and souls and so on. In your student books, you have a little section here, which we're going to skip, that talks about what you might find in some of these worlds. If you were to take a some kind of spiritual spaceship and travel to some of those other worlds, what might you find hanging out in those worlds? So you can see that. We're going to leave that for you to do on your own. Okay, let's keep moving here because we're running out of time. Okay, so fine. So we said we have Bria, Yitzir, Asiya. We understand how they fit in all this grand scheme of things and why God creates the world in that process. We see a parallel within ourselves, so we can relate to this concept, this three-stage process of development and how it works within ourselves. But why is this relevant to us? How's that information useful and helpful to us, right? So here are going to be a few ways we can make this relevant and useful to us. The first thing is when we say that our thought, speech, and action parallel Bria, Yitzir, Asiya, and what that means is that they're just like Bria, Yitzir, Asiya are in a sense outside of the divine, right? Our thought, speech, and action are outside of ourself. They're external to us. So what that means is that there doesn't have to be a complete and perfect harmony between our insides and our outsides, right? Imagine you're an angry person, you have a bad temper, right? Or a very lazy person, a procrastinator, whatever, one of those things. Just because you possess those traits doesn't mean you have to act on them, right? Today, it's in vogue to express your true self, right? Which is whatever I'm feeling, you just let it out, right? But the truth is, we know that that's not what it means to be a mensch. A mensch, right? What does the word mensch mean, right? The word mensch is already an English word. It's a Yiddish word, doesn't really have a definition in English. A mensch means somebody who is in control of themselves, right? Somebody who's compassionate and kind and all the qualities of somebody that you want to hang out with. Is that a description of what's going on inside them? Does that mean they're not triggered by things, that they have shortcomings, they have a certain darkness inside themselves? No, that's not what it means. It means they don't act on that. It means they're not impulsive, right? And reactive. They're in control of that. Somebody who's mastered their garments, their expressions. So you can have negative traits inside, but just because you have negative traits doesn't mean you have to be a miserable person. Doesn't mean you have to be somebody that nobody wants to hang out with. This guy once came to the doctor and he said, "Doctor, I need you to help me." What's the problem? He said, "I talk to myself." The doctor said, "Well, is it harming you in any way?" He says, "No, it's not harming me." So he says, "Okay, so don't worry about it. Go home, go live your life." Millions of people talk to themselves all the time. He says, "Yeah, but doctor, you don't understand. I'm such a nudnik." So I'm very annoying. I think that's how you translate nudnik for this joke, right? So just because inside you might have that doesn't mean you have to behave that way, right? That's what it means to be a mensch. So the fact that we now know that our thought, speech, and action, our garments, are not internal, they're external, they're not who we are, but the way we express ourselves, now we can recognize that just because I feel a certain way or think a certain way doesn't mean I have to act on it. Doesn't mean I have to say everything that comes to mind. Doesn't mean I have to, to think it or to behave in that way. And we have the capacity to control our garments. Because they're external, we have the capacity to change them easily. Just like we said, it's easy to put on one shirt, take off another one, and put on, change your clothing from one to the other, and wear other people's clothing. So maybe I'm not feeling loving now. I could still act loving. I could still speak lovingly. I could still do all those things, right? Just like I can wear something that today I feel like I'm wearing, black clothing, whatever. I can still put on, bright sunny yellow something, right? Doesn't have to be. We don't have to be locked into that. In fact, the word mensch, there's no one word in English that captures the word mensch, but there is a word in Hebrew that captures the word mensch. You know what that is? What would that word be in Hebrew? Adam. Right? Man is called human. It has many different words in Hebrew. You have Adam, you have Enosh, you have Ish, you have Gever, right? Different words. But in traditional Hebrew, the word Adam would be the highest form of compliment of a human being. Adam.
What is Adam?
Adam means human. Adam. And Adam was called Adam, that's the word Adam. He was the first human. So he was called human, Adam. Now, the word Adam is a 3-letter word in Hebrew. You'll see your chart on page 24. And the word Adam is an acronym for 3 Hebrew words. Aleph for Alefcha, which means thought. Alefcha really means teaching, but teachers hopefully are thoughtful about what they teach, and the things that they're saying are meaningful. And learning, so that's an intellectual pursuit. That's Adam as Alefcha. Daled is dibur, speech, and Mem is maaseh, action. So Adam, the word Adam, is an acronym for the 3 garments, for thought, speech, and action. So what makes a mensch a person who can control their impulses, essentially? And that's something that we all have the capacity to do. In fact, we do it all the time. Any number of times during the day, we're controlling impulses, right? Sometimes we don't, right? Okay, and that's part of the process of becoming more of a mensch, right? But all the time we do it. It's something that innately we have the ability to do. And why is it so easy, or in a sense, or why is it something that we have the capacity? Because it's something external. How I feel, that's going to be a much more involved process. But how I behave, that's something that's completely in my control. Okay, so that's something that we get from this idea of Bri Yitzir Asiya being or Bia, right? These three worlds being outside, external, how they parallel our thought, speech, and action, which are also external. And the first relevant, impactful lesson from that takeaway is we can control our impulses. We can control them. Okay, let's take a look at text 8. A very interesting story from one of the teachers of the Arizal. We mentioned before, Rabbi Bitzal Ashkenazi, known as the Shita Mekubetzet, for a very famous work. He says like this, an interesting text, text 8, page 25. There was once a sage who sent a drawing of his face to a physiognomist, a master who discerns temperament and character from one's outward appearance. When the master saw the drawing, he immediately blocked his face in fright. The messenger who brought the drawing asked him, "Why have you blocked your face from looking at the drawing?" The master replied, "I've never seen the face of such a horrible person before. I saw in him coveting, adultery, and robbery. One shouldn't gaze at the face of such evil." The messenger was obviously terrified of bringing back this reading to the sage. However, the sage sent word that he should return without fear. Upon his return, the sage inquired about what had occurred. The messenger conveyed everything that he had heard, concluding, "That's why I was afraid to return to you." The sage replied, "Surely this physiognomist outshines all others. Everything he said about me is true. My internal inclination drives me and seduces me to commit all of the wrongdoings that the master saw. Yet I use my wisdom to refrain from acting on it." So just because I have that inner world doesn't mean I have to act on it, right? That's a mensch. That's somebody who has gained mastery over their garments, their levushim, their impulses. Okay. Another takeaway from understanding this, the worlds of Bia, of Bri Yitzir Asiya, is let's look at it this way. The idea of Bria corresponds to thought, Yitzira to speech, and Asiya to action. Whenever we want to do anything, we go through a 3-step process. The first thing we do is we think about it. The next thing we do is we seek counsel and advice, bounce an idea off of somebody, right? Hopefully. And finally, then we put it into action, right? So these are those are 3 steps. And by the way, sometimes maybe you don't talk, maybe you're planning a surprise party and nobody knows about it, right? Usually you're also telling people about it and they're helping coordinate, but whatever, let's say something you don't want to talk to, the top secret, you don't say a word to anybody. It's not likely that you'll ever do anything without telling anybody ever before doing it. But let's say theoretically it's possible. Still, it goes through this process of speech where you're really refining and articulating that idea and actually bringing it down into action. It still nevertheless goes through this process of speech. But the point is, in very basic and elementary terms, you think about what you want to do, you speak about it, to consult with others, and then you put it into action. That's thought, speech, and action. Just like God creates the world through Bria, this idea of thinking it, and then very minimal existence, speaking it a little bit more, and finally into putting into action as it concretizes and takes on the corporeal form in its lowest final stage. And the lesson for us is that whenever we do things, we should access all 3 of these steps. There's some people who are very creative, have great ideas. I know some people. I have friends that are far more creative than I am, and whenever they call me, I know they're calling me with an idea that they want me to do. It's like a pattern. It's like a joke at home. I tell my wife, "Oh, this guy's calling. He's got something for me to do," and it's usually a great idea. By the way, it's a great idea. But he excels at coming up with great ideas, not so much in seeing them through, right? Some people are great, they're not very creative, but they're great at seeing things through. Some people are good communicators. Some people think they don't need to seek other people's advice. I'm very headstrong. I have an idea and I'm just going to do it. I'm not going to ask anybody for their opinion. I don't care what anybody thinks. Well, from what we've studied here tonight, it's good to go through all 3 steps, all 3 stages. Yeah, go ahead.
What if it's a bad thought? Right? We have a negative thought.
Right.
We want to cut right there. We don't want to
Sure.
think about it or
Sure.
act
So-
on it. So what do we?
So we change the topic in your mind, change the channel. You don't think about it. And that we have the capacity to do. Now, by the way, sometimes, especially when you're bothered by incessant thoughts and worries, and concerns, it takes a lot of work and effort to start changing that. But ultimately, that's what we have to do. Stop thinking about it. Sometimes we think things, like I said, getting again off the subject a little bit, but we're always thinking. But even though our thought process is sort of the bridge from the subconscious to the conscious self, on the one hand, on the other hand, most of the day we might be thinking subconsciously. So you can walk around during the day anxious, and you don't even know why you're anxious. But it's because you don't even know you're thinking worrisome thoughts, not even realizing that that's what you're thinking. Because your default, for some people are wired that way for whatever reason, that their default thought process is scary or negative or worrisome thoughts or whatever. And you're walking around, you don't even notice that you're feeling anxious and stressed out. But suddenly you tap into, you realize, what am I thinking about? I can think consciously about something, and I can choose to think about this or think about something else. So yeah, it takes effort, but we have that ability to replace one thought with another thought. Okay. Okay. So let's take a look at text 9. The behavior of properly functioning people is based.
What page is this now?
Text 9, page 29. Text 9. The behavior of properly functioning people is based on and guided by 3 things: thought, speech, and action. First comes thought. Those thoughts are then expressed via speech to others, such as when consulting friends who understand the specific field for the sake of arriving at a clearer and more accurate picture of the matter. This allows a person to arrive at a practical conclusion whereby their thoughts and discussions are translated into concrete action. Thought alone is insufficient. Similarly, contemplation with subsequent discussion is not enough. We must bring our plans to action. At the same time, in order for an action to be complete, it must reflect the reality that it is simply the third link in the chain, following forethought and helpful discussion. Otherwise, our actions will be rash. When we engage all 3, thought, speech, and action, and in that particular order, we can reach our full potential, just as the hierarchy of the worlds is complete, only with all 3 worlds present in their specific order. Right? So we need to not just go through all 3 steps, but also in that specific order of Beriya, Yitzira, Asiya, thought, speech, and action. When we do that, then we can be living and working and functioning in an intentional way. And a final application of this. And the final application of doing these things in this order. Let's take a look at text 10 from the Code of Jewish Law. Okay? Code of Jewish Law, right in the beginning of the Code of Jewish Law, text 10. As soon as we wake up, we should contemplate before whom we are lying and become aware that the King of Kings is close at hand. As it is stated, the entire earth is filled with his glory. It is best to habituate ourselves immediately upon waking to recite Modeh Ani, I thank you, living and eternal King, for you have mercifully restored my soul within me. Great is your faithfulness. This will remind us of God's intimate presence and inspire us to rise energetically. Seeing that the Modeh Ani does not include a divine name, we are permitted to recite it before ritually washing our hands. So this is Code of Jewish Law telling us what happens when we wake up in the morning. You just woke up. You're lying in bed. You just opened your eyes. What's the first thing you should do? Think, thought. What are you thinking? Think that you're in the presence of the King of Kings. And you're present of the King of Kings. If you're standing in front, if you're laying in bed in front of a king, wouldn't you spring out of bed? So the first thing is you're thinking, I'm laying in front of God. God is present. He's everywhere. He's right here. Once you think that, the next thing you do is what do? You speak. You say Modeh Ani. First words out of your mouth is acknowledging God, thanking God, right? Developing this gratitude. Another bigger topic beyond the scope of tonight. Acknowledge and thank God for giving me a new opportunity at life, right? And we say that right before washing the hands. The first thing we do when we get out of bed is we wash our hands. The ritual washing of the hands, which we do in the morning, the idea of the washing of the hands is to elevate our mundane. So we're about to go into the world and work and go about life. And we want that everything we do should be elevated, should be divine, should be holy, should be divinely focused and geared. So we do that. The hands, which are external, represent action, represent deed outside of ourselves, the most physical part of ourselves. We wash them to elevate them so that they also are brought into. So we have this full sequence from right when we wake up in the morning, from thought into speech, into action, so that we get started, so that we can live our lives like a mensch. And we'll conclude just going full circle, something we said right in the beginning about the function of Kabbalah, the purpose of Kabbalah, and how we're going to, each class is going to discuss Kabbalistic ideas and then see how they're relevant in our daily lives. Hopefully tonight's class you found very practical and relevant as well, is that the Rebbe once wrote to address the symposium on Jewish mysticism. This is in the 80s. And he wrote a letter to the conference, and in the letter he wrote that what separates Jewish mysticism from all other forms of mysticism is that in Jewish mysticism, the deed is the most important. Action is the most important. That as lofty as you're going to climb, and as much as you're going to, esoteric, as mystical you're going to get, as abstract as you're going to go, at the end, it's the practical that's most important. That in the end, God, the end is rooted in the beginning, and the beginning in the end. The greatest, most meaningful connection with God happens in the material, in the physical, and that's something that's unique to Jewish mysticism. So with that in mind, everything we learn hopefully becomes practical. We see how it's relevant, how it's practical, how it enhances our lives. And it should be a wonderful couple more weeks. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Very
Rabbi.
much.